Welcome to the fifth in a series of interviews with candidates to replace Representative Niki Tsongas in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm Peggy Wardjulin, a member of Concord Citizens Protecting Progress. Today we welcome Barbara L'Italienne, State Senator from Andover. Thanks so much for taking the time to come.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Most of the questions will be about your knowledge and philosophy of government, as well as your strategies for making decisions.
Okay.
We'll end with a lightning round, asking you to quickly comment about other issues important to our members.
Okay.
Let's start with a 2-minute biography. What would you like voters to know about you?
Well, I think it's important for people to know that I've served both in the House, in the Senate, and on a school committee over the last 15 years, as well as serving in the office of the State Treasurer. So I have 15 years of relevant experience dealing with budgets, dealing with legislation, standing up on behalf of my constituents, because constituent service is a huge portion of any elected position. That I've, been a strong, bold, progressive leader over the last 15 years, unafraid to stand up during gay marriage, during healthcare debate, during criminal justice, and on behalf of the environment, and brought a lot of my own personal experience as the mother of a child with autism. And that was really my motivation running for office, was my son Rudy, who's now 28. I had to become an advocate on his behalf, and found in the process of putting things together like a school for kids like him who were sitting home without an education, support groups, and the Asperger's Association of New England, that I was a pretty damn good advocate, and that I could take that to the legislature on behalf of at first kids with autism, but then by extension with my service in the House and the Senate, my district. And I want to take that mission of helping others and serving others down to Washington now.
Okay. The first group of questions asks about your opinions about the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
What types of programs should the federal government be responsible for?
Well, I think it is a core mission of government to provide a safety net. I'm a big believer that those folks who traditionally are voiceless, the poor, the elderly, the disabled, working folks, really need to have a safety net. And so I can remember my mom telling stories about when her dad died in the 40s. There was no Social Security, and so all of her older siblings had to give up their lives essentially and stay home, not get married, to be able to keep a roof over their mother's head. And so things like Social Security disability, like the Children's Health Insurance Program, Medicare, Medicaid, food programs like SNAP, those are all critically important functions of government, in my opinion. I think that government can and must do good and provide support for people, and so I see that as a critical need. If you look at our current administration, they only seem to be concerned about security. And I think I understand why. I think that President Trump is a very wealthy man, and the one thing that his wealth has not been able to buy is a sense of security and stability in the world. And so to me, that is probably why he and others feel that the only core purpose of government is to provide national security. I think it goes well beyond that. I think that we owe people an opportunity to get an education. I think we fall down in terms of what we do right now with charging young people with student loans that are federally insured, charging them 7.5% and up is outrageous, because you cannot get out of repayment of those loans through bankruptcy or through death. And so I think that we need to step up and do more for education. My dad, by virtue of the GI Bill, having served as a teenager, a 17-year-old in World War II, was able to come out of living in Lawrence in a triple-decker and, upon return from World War II, attend Boston College, get a master's in physics, and become an FBI agent. That was transformational for my family. I really believe that education is something that we ought to be providing as well, and healthcare for sure. The fact that we have a health insurance coverage doesn't necessarily mean we have health care if we can't afford our copays, deductibles, caps on service, and where our medications fall in the formulary. I really believe that government ought to step up, and we're the only nation in the world that is a developed nation that does not offer a true healthcare product for people that will not bankrupt them. I think we need to do better.
Sure. Describe one program run by the federal government you feel is especially successful and effective, and explain why you think that is so.
Okay, well, I mean, I think it's important that we have this children's health insurance program. I think that it's critically important to understand that having kids have health insurance coverage, regardless of what state they're in. This is a federal program. You know, we do well by people here in Massachusetts, but there's extreme poverty in other portions of the country. And making sure that children have access to health insurance coverage, I think, is critically important.
Now describe a federal program you feel is not successful. What improvements would you suggest?
Well, my understanding is right now the Veterans Administration is going through a lot of difficulty. I think a lot of it has to do with capacity. I think that particularly with the return of servicemen now from the Iraq wars, the Afghanistan wars, that we just don't have the capacity to be able to deal with the large numbers of folks who are surviving and coming back with traumatic brain injuries, coming back with PTSD, substance abuse. I think that the Veterans Administration, in theory, is a very good thing, but I think that we need more folks working there to clear the backlog. And I do think that we need to work out a better solution for those for whom getting to a VA hospital is just really difficult. I worked on a working group a few years ago when I was in the House, looking at connectivity from, places that are far from Bedford, far from Jamaica Plain, to be able to get veterans into the services that they need. So I think that we need to work on those issues, and there needs to be some portability and flexibility to be able to go to your local hospital. But I'm not in favor of privatizing the Veterans Administration services. I think that it's critically important that we improve upon what's there, but that we maintain the Veterans Administration as we know it.
Thank you. When is it appropriate to make use of private sector resources like outsourcing and public-private partnerships for government functions?
Well, we have to understand that when we are privatizing, someone is making money off of whatever piece of government they have picked up. And so I'll give you a prime example. Here in Massachusetts, we really decided to privatize a lot of our human services back in the 90s during the Weld administration. We moved away from state provision of human services. And so we have wonderful organizations. I happened to work for the ARC of Massachusetts doing their disability policy for 2 years. We have ARCs and we have other day program providers. But the pay that comes down to those privatized services that goes out to workers is consistently below what we pay our state workers. The benefits are consistently below. When you get into privatization, and those are nonprofits, so let's be clear, they're not necessarily exacting a profit, but there becomes a real differential in what workers are paid. If you look at what we've done here in the transportation sector, the same thing, as we move towards privatization of some of the MBTA services. If you have a for-profit company providing services that the government typically does, something's got to give because they've got to answer to their shareholders, they've got to be profitable. And so, that profit comes usually at the expense of workers. So I think that privatization might sound great, that we take things off the books and we don't have to worry about them. But we've seen here with our rail, with our transportation and what's happened with that over the last couple of years that it's been extraordinarily difficult. And so I'm not a big fan of privatization.
Thank you. What federal government programs have you or members of your extended family benefited from? I know you've
Well, I
answered some of
mentioned the
these.
GI Bill from my dad. That was absolutely transformational. I would say obviously Medicare, the onset of the Medicare program was critically important for seniors to be able to have a health insurance product. My mom suffered with Alzheimer's over the last 7 years of her life. She had lived with my family for over 20 years. In fact, when my kids were little, she helped with their caretaking when I first entered into politics when they were young. The Medicare program helped her enormously. It enabled, by and large, most of the hospital stays that she had for accidental falls, broken hips, a broken shoulder, were by and large covered. She was very fortunate that she had not just Medicare, but she also had the federal benefit of having a decent Medigap program, and some people really struggle with paying for that Medigap. She happened to have a very good one by virtue of my dad's federal service. But I would say that the Medicare program served my mom extraordinarily well. And I think that, I've heard there are issues with Medicare that we certainly need to address and work on. One of my big concerns is that when we started the Medicare Part D program for prescription coverage, that was critical for other parts of the country that had no prescription coverage. We had a wonderful program here called Prescription Advantage that, in Massachusetts, that didn't have what's called a donut hole. At the federal level, you have a donut hole where you pay you are covered up to a certain point, then you have to pay out to fill this gap, which is the donut hole, and then when you come up out of that, then the federal government pays again. So that piece, I think, the prescription piece really needs to change. I think we need to work towards a bulk purchasing program, just one single solitary prescription drug program, so that we are not wasting money in terms of who covers what formulary, which drug, at what cost. I think there needs to be one single buying program where we use the power of our sheer numbers to drive down prices on prescription drugs. Spoke with someone recently who's on Medicare, who is a retired attorney. He has multiple myeloma, and it's costing him $700 every 3 weeks out of pocket with his Medicare prescription drug program to be able to pay for that drug. And he can afford it, but what do other people do? Do they go without? Do they die? So I feel like the Medicare program is good. It needs some changes, I believe. I think some of the reimbursement rates that happen for doctors are disincentivizing primary care docs, driving doctors into certain types of diagnostic medicine because they get reimbursed at a much higher rate for certain procedures versus others. So an X-ray, you're paid a very low amount, but if you do something like an MRI or something more sophisticated, you're paid at a much higher amount. So it's not perfect, but it's the closest thing to a nationalized program, which is where I think we need to get to with our medical insurance for everybody.
Sure. All right, the next set of questions is about how you obtain and use information. What is a fact to you, and how are facts important in your decision making?
Well, I will tell you, over the last 15 years serving as a legislator, facts are incredibly important to me. Facts need to be indisputable. They need to be research-based. They need to be evidence-based. It's interesting. People think that as a legislator, you know everything about everything, and that's impossible. A good and effective legislator knows where to get good information from experts, and that information gathering and going to people that you trust are giving you true facts as opposed to trying to slant their information. That is the beginning and the basis of any good policy-driven decision making. So it's gathering facts with experts, combining that with, work on the ground and what you're hearing from people in a given, on a given subject matter on how things are working. So to test out whether the policy that you're thinking about and or something that's in place, whether or not it's truly working or whether there are unintended consequences. So it's really a process of collecting facts, working with experts, working with advocates, working with practitioners on behalf of and with your constituents, and also collaborating with your colleagues to be able to get something done. And, over my 15 years, I've seen many people that are very strong in policy or very, good at talking about problems, but moving beyond that and being able to effectively take that information and work it into manageable policy that you can actually get passed in the legislature or through the budget if it's a funding issue, and then get it implemented. Those are really 5 steps along the way to getting things done. And I've had extraordinary success being able to do that. And I'll give you one example with autism medical insurance coverage. When I walked in the door to the legislature in 2003, I was paying premiums for my son and my 4 kids. My 2 with asthma could get treatment on demand. My child with autism could not get any coverage for what he needed. We paid out of pocket. In fact, the practitioners had long waiting lists, and if you couldn't afford $250 an hour, just step aside and the next person will take your slot. And so that was really upsetting and worrisome to me. And I wondered what happened to the kids whose families couldn't afford. And so I set out to change that and require that medical insurance cover autism treatments. The failure of doing that meant the kids were not going to be able to realize their best potential. It also meant that kids who did not get that assistance early on, were going to hit the school systems and perhaps, explode. That's certainly what happened with my son when he hit the public school system in 1995. And, we were shown the door and asked to leave the school system. And then there was nowhere to go, so I had to start a school. But the point is that he ended up going out of district for $100,000 a year, plus transportation for over a decade. And so the failure to have insurance kick in and partner and be part of the solution, this notion that they didn't have to cover it when families were on the hook and government was on the hook through our education system or our adult services system, just was wrong. So I gathered my facts over the years. We were in a period of time after we passed universal coverage where you could not put any new mandates in. So I used that time to gather facts, find out what other states were doing, consider what model legislation might look like for insurance coverage. And then after 6 years of doing all of that hard work, introduced legislation. We passed it in a year and a half. But it was all the hard work that went beneath that of gathering the facts, of working with the parents and the professionals and, informing my colleagues. And they trusted that I was a leader on this issue and I was giving them good information. And so you kind of have to set that groundwork bit by bit, have a foundation, if you will, to be able to be successful and get something passed. And then even at that, I was able to understand that I couldn't get everything I wanted and needed. I was able to get private insurance passed for medical mandated coverage, but not Mass Health right away. And so went back as soon as I was finished in 2010 passing private insurance, go back and redouble my efforts to bring in the Mass Health population because there was an inherent inequity if you had private insured people being covered and poor people not. And so, but it's all driven by facts and making sure you have good facts and that you know where to get those and that you are making your best judgments based on the facts at hand.
Sure. How do you communicate with people who trust different information sources than you do?
Well, right now that seems to be a huge challenge in our country. I agree that, depending on where you look for your information, really shapes your worldview. I happened to, I'm not a big Fox News person. I happened to crash into Fox and Friends last week. I don't know if you realize that, but I went on the National Fox and Friends program. There was an opportunity there to, in my opinion, break through and speak about the separation of children at the borders and how wrong that is on so many levels. It's illegal, inhumane, and should not be happening, immoral as well. I think that the average Fox viewer doesn't view it that way because it's being presented in a very different fashion. And so we have a real problem on our hands when we are talking about anyone who disagrees with us equals fake news. That's a real problem. If your news sources are the New York Times, versus the New York Post, right? Very different worldview. If your news source here in Massachusetts is the Boston Globe versus the Boston Herald, entirely different viewpoints on the same issue. And so we have a real problem, and I think that the only way we break that down is by the hard work of engaging in conversations with people and searching for middle ground and trying to find where we overlap in our values and building it from there. And that's, what I've tried to do over the years as a legislator representing a swing district when I was in the House. And in my current Senate district, I have two communities that voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And I work with them on issues that we can agree on, and we build it from there.
Sure. All right, let's move on to the specific elected position you're running for.
Sure.
Why do you want to be the U.S. Representative for Massachusetts District 3?
Well, I would love to replace Niki Tsongas and be the 3rd Congressional for a number of reasons. I think at this point in time, experience really matters. And having someone who has the judgment and the experience of being a legislator, having done the hard work of constituent services for people, making sure that I'm willing and able to be a strong leader and stand up and speak out on things that are really important. I've never shied away from tough issues. When I was a freshman legislator, gay marriage came up. Many colleagues with much more experience than I went and literally hid in their offices during our constitutional conventions over the 3 years that took place. I decided that even though I was from a swing district and could very well lose my seat, that I was going to commit myself to do the right thing. I sensed the historic nature of standing up on behalf of gay marriage and took an active role. I planned out with another House member all of the speakers over the numerous hours that our constitutional conventions went. I act as a whip. So here I'm a freshman legislator and I'm whipping seasoned folks in the House, to get a sense of what our vote counts were at every step of the way. I took a very proactive role. For that reason, I've been placed in both a book written about equal marriage, since it really started here in Massachusetts, and in the documentary Saving Marriage, because after that 2004 election cycle, given that I was in a swing district, Governor Romney targeted me as most likely the easiest person he could turn out of office. And the optics of that were really critical that not happen, because if I had been turned out, it would have sent a chilling effect among other states. They would not have brought up equal marriage because they would have been afraid that it would mean that they'd lose their seats. So never been afraid to stand up, take tough stands on issues. So I think leadership, particularly when it's not a popular thing, really matters. So my leadership, I was turned out of my church for being both being endorsed by Planned Parenthood and for my stand on equal marriage. So I think leadership and a backbone really matters. And in that instance, it was about playing defense and defending against taking a right away from someone that had been granted by the courts. So in my mind, experience matters, showing that you're willing to stand up for people, showing that you're not afraid to take tough votes, showing that you're willing to reach across the aisle and work on issues that are concerning to everyone. So a lot of the work I do for seniors, for disabled people, around education and special education, those should never be partisan issues. They really shouldn't. And so I would work with my Republican colleagues, particularly in my House seat, to make sure that we worked together. We were sharing a community, and we needed to work together on what that community needed. So in my mind, this is a natural progression for me after having served in the House and the Senate. I think that now more than ever, we need an experienced legislator to go down into Washington, not be afraid to get down there and work hard on behalf of people. I don't see this as a stepping stone for me. I don't see myself ever running for, a higher office beyond Congress. I, want to go down there and truly represent people here in the 3rd Congressional District. I think that might differ from some of the motivations of some of the other folks in the race.
This is a very diverse district. How do you plan to represent the interests of people with such varying concerns and views of what government can and should do?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I hearken back to my current experience in the state Senate. 2 of the communities that I have voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And then I represent the city of Lawrence, which shows great, ethnic and cultural diversity. Almost 80% of the people in Lawrence now are Latino. And so, what I have is the ability to work with, a diverse ethnic population in the city of Lawrence and understand how to work with gateway cities, because there are many of them in this district. Not here in Concord for sure, but we have Haverhill and Lawrence and Lowell and Marlborough and Fitchburg and Gardner. And I have that experience working with cities and helping partner with them to bring state and federal resources to help both government, entrepreneurship, and our nonprofit organizations and our small businesses. I also, as I said, represent communities that vote overwhelmingly for Trump, and they voted overwhelmingly for Niki Tsongas and for me in the last election cycle, because in those districts I showed up. I went to all their local events. I go to their veterans events. I go to their meat raffles. When the Kinder Morgan gas pipeline was going to come through Tewksbury, Dracut, and Andover, I worked with the local folks that were going to be impacted by that were going to, particularly in Dracut, have their historic family farms have a high-pressure pipeline come through. Very concerned about, when those were going to be, the pressure valves were going to be released, what kind of mercury and other toxins were going to be released in the air. And we had people that were, grass-fed cattle farms, all-purpose vegetable farms, pumpkin farms, hay farms, etc. And I stood up and with those folks, and many of them are Republican, and they appreciated that I stood up for them. And so that really was more important than party affiliation. So I'm used to working with folks from all stripes. Dracut happens to be a rural area. My hometown of Andover is more like Concord. It's a wealthy suburban community. And really, the 37 cities and towns fit into those three boxes. There are a lot of gateway cities, there are rural areas, and there are suburban areas as well. And so I feel like I am uniquely qualified to deal with all three.
What concerns do you hear about from voters most often, and what are the issues you were most concerned about personally?
What I hear about most often, I would say healthcare, without a doubt. People are having great difficulty affording healthcare. I've been endorsed in Massachusetts by the single-payer organization that wants a Medicare for All program, and I truly believe that we need to have that. Also been endorsed by Mass Nurses, and because they know I've been working on healthcare issues over the last 15 years. I also hear a lot about education, a lot of concern about the federal government move to privatize and to expand the use of vouchers and charter schools in education, and have the endorsement of the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers, because I've been working on education issues the entire 15 years I've been a legislator, and have the experience not only as a parent, but as a legislator and a member of a school committee. So I see it from many different angles. So education is something I hear a lot about. A lot of people are really concerned about the environment, and rightly so. We have lost our standing in the international world by stepping away from the Paris Climate Accord. Certain states have stood up individually to do things like New York, Massachusetts, California, but we need to regain our standing in the international world, and we need to acknowledge that the climate change science is real, and we need to be working on ways that we can reduce emissions. It's astounding to me that our president wants to lower the gas emission standards. It's just, we're going in the wrong direction. I really believe that we need to fortify our ability to access wind, solar, hydro. We need to work on how we're going to store all those energy sources. That's critically important as well. In the House and in the State Senate, I've been able to vote for the expansion of solar in this state. What we did in 2008 was critically important for really the massive expansion of the solar, the ability to use solar both in solar farms and on people's homes, and a solar industry here in Massachusetts. We need to do more of that. What we just passed in the past week in the Massachusetts legislature will double the requirement that our utilities look for green energy sources and move away from fossil fuels. We are going to be receiving, once the Vineyard wind power is put up, we're going to be receiving electricity at 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour. I mean, that's incredible, right? And we are going to be going forward with hydro as well. So all those things need to happen, not just here in Massachusetts, or not just, incredibly, Texas is doing really well with wind power. We need to do that as a nation. not just as a patchwork quilt of some states that are trying to put this together. We need to move away from fossil fuels. And I've signed a no fossil fuel pledge. I really believe that, in the funding of elections, we should not be seeking out money from people who are, bent on trying to influence you and steer you to stay where we are in terms of fossil fuels and not be encouraging the use of alternative energy sources.
Sure. Please tell us about how you're financing your campaign.
Sure. Well, I will tell you that as one of 8 children, I did not come from a wealthy family. I do not have wealthy lineage, which some folks do in this race. I do not have a political daddy, which some folks have in this race. I'm really doing this on my own merits, my own track record of what I've been able to do in the legislature. And one of the most unfortunate things about running at this level is the inordinate amount of time you have to spend calling people on the phone that you don't know, asking for money to invest in your campaign. When I ran for the state house, I would go knock on doors all day long, and I'd actually drop about 3 dress sizes. Not happening this time around, because you can't just go knock on doors and engage person to person. It's outrageous that it's so driven by money. And part of that is that we don't have a national publicly funded structure for campaigns. There are matching funds, I guess, at the gubernatorial level, but there isn't where we are. There is at the presidential, but not at congressional level. And so many people judge viability, but by how much money you have. So we have a gentleman who's been able to raise over $2.5 million by virtue of the mayor of Boston, putting pressure on lawyers, developers, and unions for him. We have someone who's got a wealthy father who was the Bank of America president. I don't have that. So I am raising money in smaller increments. With what happened and going on Fox and Friends, we actually were able to raise some money from all over the country with people that appreciated my willingness to step up and be bold. But for me, I would say the piece that I do not like is having to call and ask people for money. And so I think we're 4th in terms of fundraising. So we're doing really a hybrid campaign. We're not going to be a high dollar, completely paid for everything campaign. We are going to have money to be able to go and do ads on TV, but we are also doing a very vibrant door-to-door grassroots. We've had people, just hundreds of people helping us knock on doors and make phone calls. We also do videos where we talk about, my tagline is that I'm a mom on a mission, because my mission was really to care for and protect my son with autism. And as I mentioned earlier, from that it extended to being able to take that mission and advocate for many in the State House. And now my mission is to try to take all that I've learned and use those advocacy skills to Washington. So that's my very personal reason why I've been a mom on a mission. But we've interviewed women we've met along the campaign trail to talk about what their mission may be. And there are various missions. I was talking with some folks last night who work in a Head Start program in the Fitchburg area, and they're going to tape a video for me and talk about their being a mom on a mission. So we've just, tried to employ real strong grassroots campaigning combined with, the unfortunate need to raise some money to be able to do the print materials and the TV to be able to reach 735,000 people. But I really think that 2 things. I think there ought to be a nationally funded policy on this so that money doesn't equal viability. And I also think that we need to get money out of politics and end Citizens United. And I have not only sponsored but voted on behalf of trying to send a message down to Washington on Citizens United on 2 different occasions.
Okay. Let's see. What are your criteria for accepting or declining contributions?
Well, I would say that, to the greatest extent possible, when someone gives us a contribution, we want to be certain that is not someone from the fossil fuel industry. We want to be sure that is not someone from a large-scale Wall Street, firm or a big bank. You really try wherever possible to really control for who's giving to you and why. And so that really governs who I call. If I see someone that might give a lot of money to people and yet I don't like where they work or what they stand for, I will not call them. And so, we really do try to be as careful as we possibly can.
Sure. National politics is increasingly marked by rancor and division, and dealing with this will be a large part of the job. Mm-hmm. Describe a past situation where you had to work to get something done with a group of people who strongly disagreed with your position.
Okay, well, let's see. I would say that whenever you're working on gun policy, there are going to be people that strongly disagree with your position. I've had the opportunity to vote for the assault weapons ban, in the 2000s, after what happened in Las Vegas. Voted on the trigger cranks and bump stock ban, and most recently on the extreme risk protection orders, which are called the red flag opportunity, just to have another tool in the toolbox so that if someone has a gun permit and is seen by their family members or people who know them as a threat to themselves or others, that you would be able to go in and remove those guns. And then there is a due process after the fact, but the feeling is that in the moment you need to remove those guns. Whenever we make any movement on gun issues, there's certainly a lot of pushback and a lot of disagreement, sometimes by my colleagues, oftentimes by some of my constituents. So folks who believe that having a gun is an all or nothing thing, that the Second Amendment right is an absolute under all circumstances, oftentimes I have to engage with people on that issue because I don't believe that it's an all-encompassing right. I don't believe that's an all or nothing issue. And so I really do try to engage with folks and try to find the gray area when it comes to gun control. I try to explain that, that we aren't looking to go after folks that are hunters. We're not going after people that are target shooters. I mean, in all 4 of my current Senate communities, they all have a gun club. I've been to those gun clubs. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about taking weapons of war off the streets and away from people who want to collect them. And so I would say that without a doubt, whenever we work on anything that has to do with guns, I get a tremendous amount of pushback from people. And so again, it's about trying to find the middle ground.
Sure. What is your philosophy on legislative compromise?
I think compromise is critical to being a good legislator. As I'd mentioned earlier in one of my examples, when I wanted to get medical insurance changed for kids with autism, I knew that if I were not willing to compromise and get a sense of where the balance, the tipping point was between how far I could get versus if I tried to go a step further, I was getting nothing. I think you have to understand that this is an incremental, governing is incremental, and passing legislation is incremental. And so you have to understand that walking away with as much as you possibly can get is so much better and moving the needle than walking away with nothing. And I'll give you an example. 2 years ago, at the end of the state legislative session, there were 6 conference committees that needed to happen. In other words, the House and Senate had each passed a different bill. You needed to sit down and confer and work it out, bring a final product forward. 5 of those conference committees went forward. I did one of them on a big rewrite of all the municipal laws that govern our state, bringing it into the 21st century, making it easier for a lot of local communities to do things without having to come up and ask the permission of the state government. So it was good. It's a good thing, and we got it done. There was another bill on non-compete clauses where they could not reach agreement. And quite frankly, my Senate colleague wanted the world and couldn't get it, and so walked away, and we got nothing. So that meant 2 more years of people going without and not having that protection. This week, we had both a health care bill and an education bill where people could not find compromise. And so we did not address those 2 issues around containing health care cost and around trying to bring forward more money under the Chapter 70 funding formula for public education. To me, that's tragic. I think that, we need to find where we can agree and, sign off and do those portions. And then you can always go back and add incrementally. But to get nothing and have nothing passed on those 2 things, I think was really a shame. So I'm a big believer in you work with others, you work through the differences. I just finished a conference committee on making sure that consumers will be better protected in the case of data breaches, particularly with what happened with Equifax. And I had to meet with my House counterparts for about 6 weeks to hammer out an agreement. But we did it. We worked it through. I got the strongest possible bill that I could get in terms of consumer protection. The Senate had a really strong bill. The House had a fairly weak bill. And the idea was to try to bring them up and strengthen to the best of my ability. And so we did that. And so I really do believe that compromise, anyone who goes in thinking they get to be absolutist or they get to be a one-man band are just destined for failure. And I know that by virtue of having 15 years of experience. The other folks in this race don't have any of that experience. So that's a huge differentiator.
Sure. So finally, let's touch quickly on some other issues important to our members. Please give a quick response to each issue.
Is it yes, no, or a sentence?
A couple sentences,
okay.
or whatever you feel.
Whatever. On some of them it might be easy.
Sure.
Yep.
Women's right to choose.
Absolutely. I'm a Planned Parenthood champion, which means I've voted for all of the requisite Planned Parenthood and NARAL priorities over the last 15 years.
Sure. Health care.
Believe in a single-payer, universal Medicare for All program, and have been endorsed by the local group because I'm seen as most likely to be the person that could work on that.
Sure. Civil rights.
Absolutely believe that it's critically important we protect the rights of minorities, be they gay people, transgender people, people of color, immigrant populations. I think that we need to protect. I'll be visiting a mosque later on this afternoon and talking with Muslim folks about their concerns. So absolutely strong on civil rights.
Sure. Net neutrality.
I actually had legislation that was passed in the state Senate. I do believe that we need a free-flowing internet. I think it's critically important for business. It's critically important for people to have access to information. And I do not think that we ought to be allowing our major providers to engage in blocking content or slowing down content.
Great. Gun regulations.
I really think we need common sense national gun policy. We've done great things here in Massachusetts. We have the lowest level of gun deaths in the nation, but we're only as safe as our neighboring communities. And this notion of allowing for a national concealed carry really makes me very nervous. I have colleagues in the New Hampshire legislature that talk about, being engaged in very, emotionally driven debate, knowing that people that are watching and or even their colleagues may be concealed carrying a gun. Very troubling.
Yeah. The latest round of tax cuts.
I believe that they were wrong. I think that they were aimed at enriching the top 1% to the detriment of everyone else. I think people are going to be shocked when they have to file their taxes this year. Some employers aren't withholding the proper amount, so that's going to be a concern. People who live in the Northeast and carry very high mortgages, when they realize they're capped at $10,000 for their mortgage interest deduction, that's going to be a shocker. And I think the very small amount of dollars in people's pockets short term is going to cause us real long-term pain.
Government policy for the situation in Puerto Rico.
I think it's really horrendous that we have, the folks in Puerto Rico are Americans, and they ought to be getting their infrastructure brought back into place as quickly as possible. I believe that, there's a responsibility on the part of the United States. If they are a part of the United States, we need to treat them as such. And it's just incredible to me that there are people that still don't have electricity, running water, their homes rebuilt, and we're entering into another hurricane season right now.
Yeah. And immigration policy.
I think we are a nation of immigrants. Unless if you were a Native American, you came here somehow. And for me, it was my grandparents coming down from Quebec to my French-Canadian grandparents to work in the mills in Lawrence. On my mom's side, it was my grandfather coming from Ireland, my grandmother from Nova Scotia. We are a nation of immigrants, and we don't understand that when we're talking about limiting who's able to come in, that we are undercutting our higher education, our medical growth. We have folks who may get returned through TPS to Haiti who have entered this country and are, providing critical services in nursing homes, in day programs for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we don't understand that we are, first of all, not going to have enough population to care for our growing elderly, and that we need folks to come in to be able to take jobs and to be able to pay in to really balance out. We're upside down in terms of our age and our population right now.
Yeah. And finally, campaign finance reform.
I think we need to have, an end to Citizens United. And again, I think, one of my favorite counterparts in this congressional campaign, one of the smartest people, I think, in the campaign, has not been able to raise a ton of money, and so that person's going to have great difficulty being viable in this race. And ironically, as I've told this person, if I were not in the race, I'd be voting for that person. That person really is supremely qualified, and yet not even mentioned as someone who's viable. Instead, we have people who've been handed a lot of money and don't have any requisite experience, and they get to claim the mantle of being viable. So we're really upside down in terms of how we do this. It's really got to be based on ideas, vision, leadership, boldness, and experience.
Thank you.
My
Thanks
pleasure.
for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was great.
Thanks. And you've been listening to the fifth in a series of interviews with candidates to replace Niki Tsongas. I'm Peggy Wardjulin, a member of Concord Citizens Protecting Progress. Thank you.